I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joe Philippek. Joe is the Director of Consulting and Continuing Education for Rails. Joe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. Again, my name is Joe Philippek. I'm Director of Consulting Continuing Education at Rails. Another hat I wear, though, is as President of the Board of Trustees for the Aurora Public Library District. So it's great to be with a number of my fellow trustees out there in Illinois library land. And on behalf of Rails, we're grateful for the service that each of you provides your library. Obviously, the role of trustee is such a critical one for public libraries. So thank you, and thank you for being here today. So we're really fortunate to have with us Amanda Standerfer today. Amanda has worked in public, academic, and special libraries since 1998 and has worn a number of different hats in her role as library, including library director. Additionally, since 2002, Amanda has served as a consultant and a facilitator, working with libraries, nonprofits, small businesses on things like strategic planning, fundraising, and organizational development, among other things. She's done this through her consulting organization, Standerfer Consulting, Fast Forward Libraries. And outside of her consulting work, Amanda also serves as Director of Development and Promotion at the Urbana Free Library downstate, and she is a frequent speaker for regional and state level training events such as the Illinois Library Association, also obviously for today for Rails. And I know that, Amanda, not too long ago you spoke about succession planning for ILA. So obviously Amanda brings a lot of great perspective. We're very grateful for her time today. So I think with that, Amanda, I'm going to turn this group over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe and Dan. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. And as you mentioned, I have recently talked about succession planning to the ILA trustees group. It's a group I've talked to a couple of times, so I've seen some familiar names and scrolling through the participants here. So I'm glad to have you all here. I'm excited that you're here because this is such an important topic. This comes up typically, so the idea of having a succession plan in place comes up usually for one of three reasons. Number one, the director is maybe nervous about a key leadership position or assistant director leaving. Number two, a board member is worried about the director leaving. Or number three, the director and a board member are worried about board leadership and someone leaving on the board. So succession planning is not just for staff, it's also for board leadership. And this desire to engage in succession planning sometimes comes from a place where a library staff member, a director, and a board member or a board member have had an experience when there's been a leadership transition in an organization that hasn't been handled particularly well, and they want to prevent that from happening again. So someone's had an experience where there's been a sudden departure and it's thrown the organization into a tailspin, and succession planning can definitely help prevent that kind of thing from happening in the future. These past experiences, if they've been bad, they can make the board or the director kind of operate from a place of fear. And that's not a great place to be when you're thinking about the future of the library and how to ensure stable leadership for the library. Sometimes the board and the director are also afraid to engage in succession planning because it means talking about loss. It means talking about someone important leaving the library. And that can be a scary thing. They don't want to raise red flags or hurt someone's feelings or damage a relationship. So they just avoid bringing it up altogether. And also, engaging in a succession planning process may be a skill that not a lot of people have. And so there's some assumptions and general anxiety about, what might surface during a succession planning process. And succession planning doesn't have an immediate payback. It's something that you do to prepare for the future, kind of like disaster planning. And then you integrate this into the rest of what you're doing at the library, the other plans and processes. So you don't see that tangible benefit right away. So this all makes it understandable why this topic gets brought up, but then quickly put to the bottom of the priority list. But I think, we've all seen over the last 18 months, a lot of change in staffing in the library sector. And in fact, the May 2021 issue of American Libraries has an article from Ann Ford that's called the Library Employment Landscape. And spoiler, if you haven't read it, it's pretty grim. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of people hesitant to go into leadership positions. Also, the sector is really diversifying. There's a lot of new people coming into the sector who are very savvy about their career and their career paths. So having a succession plan in place will help your library with recruitment and retention. And it's also about recruitment and retention of board leadership as well. So kudos to all of you for being here. During our time together, we're going to try to move past that fear that you might have of the unknown of succession planning. And I hope you'll, by the end of our time together, through what I'm going to talk about and your discussions with your peers, that you'll feel equipped to engage in a succession planning process. So I hope that by the end of our time, you'll be able to understand why succession planning is important and a necessary component for continuous learning, continuous improvement. That you'll also learn how to structure and execute a succession planning process, and you'll understand how to implement your succession plan so your library will be able to effectively respond to any changes in leadership positions. And as Dan mentioned, we'll have plenty of time for question and answer, and I'm of course available even after this session if you want to chat via email. So, what is a succession plan and why should your library have one? Change is hard in organizations, and it's hard on staff and board members, particularly when a senior member or leader steps down. Having a succession plan in place will ensure that this transition will be done intentionally and with integrity. And this will also help minimize the stress that's just inherent to this kind of change. So your first bullet on the screen is just kind of a definition of what is a succession plan. So why should you develop one? A succession plan is a guide for helping you develop internal staff talent and use board members more effectively, because during this process, you're going to spend time assessing the various roles and responsibilities at the library. And so you'll have a deeper understanding of all of the different functions that it takes for the system of the library to work. And this will help you then make plans for how to better use people and develop people for future potential leadership roles. Creating a succession plan will also help you assess risk and mitigate it through your plan. And what do we mean by assessing risk for a library? One example that comes to my mind is thinking about all of the relationships that a library director develops in the community with patrons, with different partners and organizations, with other community leaders, also with donors and funders. And, it's a risk if that director were to leave and those relationships would be damaged or set aside. So the succession plan can help detail how these relationships can be managed jointly and then handed off when a director leaves. This will help increase the sustainability of the library because it provides a path for that institutional knowledge to be shared rather than concentrated in a few leadership positions. So in short, succession plan should aim to assess the organization's needs, then create a roadmap for building talent within the organization, and clarify roles around who does what when you activate the actual succession plan, the transition plan. This is not a one-time put in the drawer thing. It's a continuous process, and it becomes integrated with any of the other plans that you have and are being carried out and implemented at the library. So it's really just another layer to what you're already doing. Okay, so how should you get started? I like to use a framework, and let me pause here for a second and say that if you don't have a current strategic plan, that's really probably where you should start. And I'm glad to hear that you had that strategic planning session, so you have more of an idea of what that process looks like. There is a way to do strategic planning and succession planning at the same time, kind of integrate those processes. But I really think that it's a good idea to have your succession plan in place because it really then guides your discussions during your succession planning process. So there's many things to consider when you start a succession planning process, and using a framework like the one on the screen, that's going to help you narrow your focus to what are you talking about and not talking about as you consider the discussions you need to have during the process. So succession planning is not just about a planned staff transition. It's about leadership development broadly within the library. And there's 3 components on the screen that you can consider as part of your process. So first, emergency succession planning. This is a plan that you will use to address an unanticipated departure of a director or a board president or officer. This is usually if you only have maybe a few days or weeks notice. Having an emergency succession plan ensures this uninterrupted performance of essential executive functions because it will outline those steps for a temporary appointment or an acting or interim director or president and any other components, which we'll talk about in a moment. The second part of our framework here, our triangle, is strategic leadership development. And this is an ongoing process that identifies those core competencies, skills, and knowledge that the organization needs, not only now, but over the next 5 years. So you're looking to the future and what it's going to take to develop those competencies within your existing staff pool or board members, or what you might, those skills, talents, and knowledge you might need to recruit from other places. And then the third piece of our triangle is a defined departure succession plan, or an anticipated succession plan, anticipated transition plan. And this is a course of action that boards and library leaderships will employ when a leadership staff member or board member begins to think about leaving an organization, or a term potentially is coming to an end. So this is a process that's going to focus on communicating about the transition to staff and stakeholders, doing that organizational assessment that I mentioned, and then recruiting new people and celebrating that transition. Ultimately, staff and board transitions are what we're planning for, whether that's anticipated or emergency. And it's prudent to consider the planned and unexpected transitions at the same time, because you want to make sure you can activate something quickly, but that then you also have thought through the steps for if there's a longer tail on a departure. Having these plans in place will allow you to have certain elements established and ready to go when it's time to activate the plan. So what are the different steps that you could take? And here's a funnel that I'm going to talk about. First, it's a good idea to get a committee together to work on a succession planning process, just the same as you would do with a strategic planning process. And this can be 4 or 5 staff members, maybe with a board member. So obviously you want to comply with Open Meetings Act, but it's a good idea just to have a group of people together to work on the process together. So your guiding question is, who would be the ideal leader for our organization over the next decade versus how are we going to replace key people? So that's a really distinct differentiation here. Succession planning is a mission-driven exercise, and eventually you will have to narrow the details at some point, but it's really good to touch base with your purpose, which is what leadership skills, knowledge do we need over the next 10 years as the scope of your succession planning process. So when you narrow to particular positions or roles at the library, you will have thought more broadly first, so you'll be able to have those conversations about what it's going to take to replace a particular position when a plan has to be activated. So, if you're not sure, what position should we be including in a succession planning process, think about the library's workflow broadly. What does it take to get things done at the library? And if there were a sudden departure by someone, how would it disrupt that workflow? And if it's a major disruption, if checks aren't going to get signed, you should think about including that position in a succession plan, because you want to make sure to have had those conversations ahead of time. So when there is an emergency departure or a planned departure, those conversations have already been had. It's important to note that during these initial stages of your succession planning process, that again, you're working at that position level, where does that work happen? And then later we'll narrow down. This process of creating these succession plans can take a little while, maybe 9 to 12 months with monthly meetings and some assignments in between. But I also want to just mention that, for smaller libraries, that may be a lot. There are lots of templates out there that you can basically just go through a set of questions and, have a discussion about them, respond, and then you've got your succession plan in place. And there's a resource page, which if you haven't received already, we'll make sure that you get, that has links to a couple of different templates that you might consider for your library succession plan. But if you want to design your own process for developing a succession plan. The funnel on the screen gives you some different steps to consider. And I think starting at the very top with a leadership assessment or a SWOT analysis is a great place to start. So you want to think about the organization's strengths and needs, particularly immediate needs or challenges as it relates to your current strategic plan. Because again, your strategic plan should be guiding what you're trying to accomplish within the community because the library exists. So think about all of those things that the library needs in order to achieve those particular goals, and then talk about what else might you need in the future. I also think during this assessment process, it's a good time to talk about organizational culture, because how the people in the library work together is a really important thing. And when there's a transition, when there's a departure of a leader, that changes the dynamics of the team, it changes the culture. So you want to talk about those things during your succession planning process. It's not just about the skills that people have to run the library, it's about how those skills present through the person as they're part of the organization. So bringing culture into your assessment can help identify maybe gaps that you might have that you could address through your succession plan. Okay, so next, you can review job descriptions and qualifications. It's a good idea to keep these updated all the time, especially in case you have an unexpected transition. This will, if you do this on an annual basis, then you can make adjustments to those job descriptions, look at the different qualifications for the role, align those with the competencies and job functions. Obviously, things are changing all the time in libraries. We're doing new things. So looking at your job descriptions for the entire organization annually is a good idea because you may need to make updates and changes. If you don't have job descriptions for your board officers, it might be a good time to think about doing that. Because again, this is something you can use as a development tool. Here's what it takes to be a successful board treasurer. Here's what it takes to be a successful board vice president. Having those detailed out also can help with recruitment of future board members. Next on our process funnel here is to create advancement pathways. So I love the idea of libraries very clearly showing staff members, here's what it takes to advance in our organization. So this document would show all of the different positions at the library, the different qualifications for each item, each position in terms of education, skills that they may need to have. And I think this also helps with retention because it's very clear then for people what they might need to accomplish in order to advance in the organization. And again, in your handouts, which I know have been put into the chat, Beloit Public Library has an awesome advancement pathway document that's linked right on their website. So I've included that in your resource page and I encourage you to look at it. It's fairly simple, but I think again, it's something that people could look at and understand. If they want to go from a clerk to a librarian, what's it going to take? That's that leadership development. Next, create cross-training plans. And this is slightly separate from succession plans, but I think is a really important component of a succession plan. And this can be done at a department level, right? Your committee that's working on your succession plan doesn't need to be involved in department level cross-training plans, but having cross-training plans in place helps with the sustainability of the organization because it allows each department to look at those key components that need to happen in order for the library to function and who in the library is trained on how to do those different components. Next, you'll develop individual development plans. I'm going to talk more about that more specifically in a moment. And then finally, at the very bottom of your funnel is the details. And this is where there's lots of questions to consider. So do you need an interim leader just to keep the organization running day to day? Do you need an interim board president? You may need to say, yes, we want an interim. And then there's several other decisions. Is that person going to be compensated? In which way? How do they manage their current position, maybe with the position they're taking on as an interim? So working through some of these questions and documenting this will help you move more quickly when you have to activate a succession plan, especially in an emergency, but also even if there's a defined departure and you're going to name an interim, you can have those decisions already spelled out in your succession plan. So again, just including things about the role of the interim, the timeline, how long might they be the interim, the compensation, other details like communication about the interim, What powers does the interim have that may be different from the director? And then even getting into details like, what does a search look like for a new director or key position in the case of recruiting board members? And again, here it depends on if you're a city or a district library, if people are appointed or elected. I still would encourage you to think about recruiting and having conversations with people and just looking at that assessment. What kinds of skills do we need? Who do we know in the community that might be interested that we could have some conversations with? So they might be ready if we have a vacancy on our board or within current board members who there has some skills and interests in developing leadership and what kind of training might that person need. Also in these details, we'll talk about communication. So what are you going to say to which audiences at what time? We'll talk more about staff in a second, but thinking about naming a spokesperson, whether that's a board member or a designated staff member, but this is the person who's going to be communicating about this transition. And often there will be a committee that's supporting this person as well. So you can jointly develop those messages that are going out. And even your succession plan could have the start of some of those messages. What are you going to say when? And then steps for when the person actually leaves, like handing off a binder or handing off keys, making sure that there's an exit interview, that there's a celebration with a defined departure. And what is the support going to look like over the first year of a new person being in a leadership position? Because just getting a new person in place is the start. That's means your succession plan has worked, and you want to support that person to be successful going forward. So all these details, things like advertising, search consultants, all of these things can be in those details of your succession plan as you're having these conversations in your process. So let's talk about staff and the role of staff in a succession plan. And certainly here we're talking more about a leadership transition versus board. But I think it's important to involve staff during these conversations. And as you're creating the succession plan, you're not doing one for the staff and one for the board. It's really, holistically about the entire organization. And again, there will be a point at which you kind of separate those things. But I think it's important to involve staff in various ways throughout the entire process. And one thing you can do is get some anonymous feedback about what staff look for in a leader. Another way to involve them is to get some feedback about recruitment and retention. So especially if you have newer staff members, it's a great idea to allow time for them to answer questions like, how did you find out about the job? What was your interview process like? What would be helpful in terms of your initial training in the future? Because I think people with those fresh eyes in an organization can give us feedback and insight that can help the library improve in the future. I think it's also great to ask staff to do kind of some personal assessments too, like what leadership roles are they already assuming? This will help you understand maybe how to better support people in the jobs that they're doing for the library and where you might need to build some future capacity. So doing a assessment of skills and competencies can give you that data from staff to better understand just the leadership landscape at the library. I also think that this will help you identify people in the leadership pipeline. So not only just like, well, we need these skills in the future for other functions, but also the person and their skills, how might they be interested in developing too? So you might discover that different staff members already have skills that you're looking for in future leadership. And then this can lead to that conversation about their interest in development opportunities. So sometimes this leads to a question of, should you name successors? And this can be a staff or board thing. For the emergency and defined departure succession planning process, we're really still talking at the position level, not the person. But at some point, you will have to get down to those details, and you will need to talk about people in that pipeline. And whether or not you're going to name a person as a successor is kind of a tough call. And I think it kind of depends on your individual library situation. You may have several people within the organization that you are developing with maybe not a promised role in the future, but rather just because it's good for the library as a whole to have more people skilled in different areas. But let's say, for example, the head of circulation will be leaving in a year. They gave a year's notice about their retirement. Sometimes that happens. And that's a good time to activate your succession plan, to start, looking internally to see if you do have staff members interested who have been engaged in leadership development and skill development. And then maybe this leads to you doing an internal search, but the succession plan would guide you in this. And that's something that during your succession plan development process, that you would have discussions about what happens if there's a defined departure of a department head. Do we do an internal search? Do we name an interim? What does that look like? So strategic leadership development plans are very individualized. And this is where board members and staff members can have discussions about what it is that they contribute to the library, what skills do they want to develop, what is their interest in taking on future leadership roles and building their capacity to take on those roles. So a lot of times these conversations happen during a performance review or maybe an annual conversation that the board president has with all of the board members. And you can just simply ask questions like, what would they like out of their career or time on the board? And what kind of advancement opportunities are they interested in? So those are things that then could be noted, and plans could be made for future trainings and opportunities to serve in different roles. So let's also talk here about implementation of your succession plan. Informally, cross-training is a really great way to just build organizational sustainability as a whole. And I mentioned that cross-training is, I think, a key part of succession planning. By doing cross-training plans, you've identified those key functions that may cause holes if someone were to leave the organization. So department directors department heads, leadership positions should be looking within their departments to say, okay, here's all of our key functions. Here are all the people trained to do these things. Are there any gaps? Are we missing anything? Do we need to bring people from other departments to learn how to do some of these different functions? I once worked for a library where there was only one person trained to do some specialized reporting in a particular technology platform that we had. And this person did leave very abruptly, and we didn't have time to do any kind of transition or training with anyone else. We hadn't done any cross-training. And luckily, this wasn't a patron-facing issue, but it was a couple of months before we were able to get the training that we needed from the vendor in order to be able to run the reports that only that person knew how to do. So this was a internally facing issue where we hadn't done a good job of succession planning or cross-training. And luckily, it wasn't something that was patron-facing, because that could definitely lead to some transition and dissatisfaction amongst patrons if it were something that was disrupted in the flow of the library. As I mentioned, succession planning is ongoing, and a way to continually kind of talk about this and build leadership is to just have regular opportunities for board members and staff members to give feedback about their satisfaction with their jobs. And this can just be, simply a quick survey or that annual conversation that you're having, asking things about how could we better support leadership development at all different levels. And again, here's a time that you might learn what people, what skills they might have that they're not using at the library that the library could take advantage of, or different training that they might be interested in participating in. This is also a great time to think about mentoring. And I think this is especially important on boards because unless you've had a really great board experience and been a part of a really high functioning board, you might not know what it takes to be a board officer. So if you're on a board and not in a leadership role, and are interested in that, it's a great idea to set up some sort of relationship between a board member and an officer, just to kind of understand what the different functions are, be able to ask questions. It definitely will help when it comes time to replace those leadership positions. Finally, don't forget how you're going to communicate with staff during a leadership transition. I have a colleague who told a story once of a board who was looking for a director and made a decision about hiring someone and put an article in the newspaper before even talking to staff. And they really, they broke some trust. They damaged some relationship with the staff by not communicating directly to the staff about who had been hired. And it took a long time for that library to recover. Okay, finally, I want to talk a little bit more about implementation, because I've mentioned that it's a continuous process. And so on your screen is a continuous process model here that I think works for lots of different things in libraries, but I think it works really well for succession plans. Professional development and leadership training should occur throughout the year, and annual staff reviews or annual discussions with board members are a great time to just review interest in leadership positions, make any adjustments to job descriptions, and then also potentially have conversations with people not on the board that you might want to eventually recruit to be on the board or to run for a board seat. Anytime there is a change in library leadership or a change in board leadership, that's another time to get out the succession plan and review it and see what, if all of the decisions that you made during the planning process are still relevant, and make any updates that you need to. So in summary, there's not one way to do succession planning. I think the most important thing is that you do something, whether that be just making some initial decisions about what would happen, doing some like if-then scenarios. But I think just thinking about it through an organizational capacity building lens is a good place to start, because it is a very broad thing that affects the entire library. I think you have to figure out what's best and right for your library, depending on the scope of what you're trying to accomplish. Again, you should be thinking broadly. What kinds of leadership skills do you need in 10 years? And where are you now? So doing that assessment and then figuring out how do we get from where we are now to 10 years will help you structure your succession plan. So at the very minimum, just reviewing job descriptions, putting in a cross-training plan, and then doing that annual needs assessment, getting kind of that feedback is a really good way to prepare for the future. I also think you can spread these discussions, capacity building discussions throughout the year at your board meetings, and then just bring those together into a document. So even if you don't have a formal committee working on this, you could have a series of discussions about future scenarios and future needs, and then just compile that all together. Take 15 minutes at the beginning of a board meeting to talk about capacity building and sustainability for the organization. Finally, having a succession plan in place will help build your confidence as board members, but also with the staff, that your library will be able to continue to operate without disruption, and it will increase engagement with you as board members and the staff who are interested in developing and advancing the library. So thank you, and Dan, I'll turn it back to you.